last thing I want to ask you about, Alex, is basically the merger of the two careers you've had. I've probably been pretty critical of your profession, which is science journalists, or journalists who cover science. Let's put it that way. Because truthfully, I think most of them are really bad. And I think many of them actually border on negligent. And I think they cause, on some levels, more harm than good to the public. Obviously, I don't put you in that category, and there are many people I don't put in that category who I think are excellent at science journalism. But they're really in the minority. So most of the sensationalized headlines, and frankly, even the news stories that just don't have the detail that I think should at least be covered in a news story, given the understanding that very few people are going to go back to the primary source and read it, places an enormous responsibility on scientific journalism. Do you think there's a systematic way to make this process better?
Oh, that's a heavy question. The problem is, or at least my perception is the problem, and this is self-serving since I'm a science journalist, is that journalism now follows the audience. And I started out in 2006, let's say, just at the point where news organizations were first starting to be able to see how many people clicked on a story. And this was, one of the great catastrophes of journalism in some ways, because it's terrifying to find out what people click on. It's unhealthy for the news organizations to find out what people click on. I can remember, so the big newspaper in Canada is the Globe and Mail. And, early on as newspapers went online, they started to, people realized it's kind of nice to have what are the top 10 most clicked on stories. So then you can go and I remember when the Globe, as far as I remember, I don't know the exact timeline, but shortly after they introduced this feature, I was like, how is it that the top 10 stories on the Globe and Mail website, like 3 of them are about Britney Spears, 2 of them are about it was just like, I thought the Globe and Mail is supposed to be the kind of highbrow newspaper in Canada, and it looks like it's a bunch of simpering morons who are clicking. But then I look at what I click on sometimes, and it's like sometimes you're just tired and you click on the sort of craziest thing. So anyway, sorry, I'm drifting off the point here, which is that to fix science journalism, you need, or to encourage good science journalism, you need people to read good science journalism. And I think newspapers are realizing that following the audience has turned out to be a bad move, because they've ended up losing the trust in audience. But by giving people what they thought they wanted, you ended up basically giving them crap, and then having people recognize that they were being fed crap, and then kind of rebel against it. So where I started my journalism, my sports science journalism career, in some sense, was I started a blog on WordPress in 2008 or something, where I was just like, you know what, I can't write this in a newspaper article, but on this blog, I know there are people who are interested in the details of what the study says. I'm going to have the key figure from the study, and I'm going to say how many people were in how many subjects there were, and what their characteristics were, and what the intervention was. And that's the blog that became, it got taken on to Runner's World in 2012, and then moved over to Outside in 2017. It turned out there was an audience for that, which is encouraging. So I guess I'm not answering your question at all, which is how do you fix it? But I think the finding an audience that appreciates it is, or at least having some, I don't know, let's see, what am I trying to say here? That the news organizations aren't going to insist on scientifically qualified journalists unless there's repercussions or feedback when there's bad journalism. And I think the initial signals were the opposite. They were actually getting feedback that the less complicated it was, and the more sensational it was, the more feedback they got. So maybe, to try and actually give one concrete answer to your question, is that the move away from advertising and towards subscription-based models, I think, has helped and hopefully will continue to help move away from like just let's do what's most sensational to let's give people a filling meal that they're not going to be hungry 10 minutes later. So maybe that trend is a good one in some ways.
Yeah. And look, I don't know that I expected you to have an answer, because this is a question I've thought about for a decade, actually. Probably around 2011 is when I started really becoming frustrated with journalism and science, which is not to say that's when it started. I think that's just when I began to notice it enough and realize that the signal to noise ratio had fallen to zero. And and of course to this, if you ask my friends, there's no better way to drive me nuts than just to forward me a headline and without even a question, like as though somehow I'm supposed to read this idiotic headline and know what your question is of me. But look, I still get 3 of those a day. So anyway, Alex, this has been awesome. Like I said, I've wanted to sit down with you for a couple of years since I read Endure, and I can't recommend it highly enough. I find it riveting. I think you're a great writer and a great storyteller, and that's to me, I think one of the gems of reading a book like that is you're reading about science, but you're also reading it in the context of amazing stories, personal stories of other individuals. So thank you very much for that contribution and all of your amazing stuff on Outside, which I can't get over how prolific you are, and it's gem after gem. This podcast is for general informational purposes only and does not constitute the practice of medicine, nursing, or other professional healthcare services, including the giving of medical advice. No doctor-patient relationship is formed. The use of this information and the materials linked to this podcast is at the user's own risk. The content on this podcast is not intended to be a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Users should not disregard or delay in obtaining medical advice from any medical condition they have, and they should seek the assistance of their healthcare professionals for any such conditions. Finally, I take conflicts of interest very seriously. For all of my disclosures and the companies I invest in or advise, please visit peteratiamd.com/about, where I keep an up-to-date and active list of such companies.